It's Marcus Hewitt. Today is 6/17/2021, June 17th. Marcus Hewitt. All right. And we are going to talk about the gastric phase of digestion here in a second. All right, so the gastric phase of digestion by Marcus Hewitt, myself. And before we talk about the gastric phases of digestion, I think it's first important to talk about the functions of the stomach. And the three main functions of the stomach are storage, digestion, and defense. And the stomach stores food and regulates its passage into the small intestine, mainly because the small intestine is so specialized and really important that it receives small amounts of food into the intestine so it can get those nutrients that's needed by the body out at a time. So if all the food that was in the stomach just passes straight into the intestines, we may miss some key proteins or key nutrients that the body needs when they pass through the intestines because it won't be able to get all those nutrients out. So that's that's the way the stomach functions as a storage unit for food. And then the stomach also functions as a digestive unit, and that's the one we're going to mainly be talking about today. And basically, the stomach chemically and mechanically digests food into a soupy mixture of uniformly small particles called chyme. And we're going to get into a little bit of how the stomach does that. And lastly, the stomach functions as a defense mechanism. And the way the stomach does this, it protects the body by destroying many of bacteria and other pathogens that are swallowed with food with that low acidity that's in the stomach, probably around like 2 pH. And that acidity kills off any bacteria or pathogens that may be swallowed with food into the stomach, or that may be sitting in the esophagus and then gets into the stomach and destroys those pathogens and bacteria so that they don't spread throughout the body. And it also serves as a defense mechanism for itself by protecting itself, the stomach lining, from the acidic environment of the stomach. And we'll also get into how that happens and the function of that as well. So next, I think it's important that we talk about the anatomy and the histology of the stomach in order to understand the digestive phase. And basically, the anatomy of the stomach is something here that you see over here, this picture. And we have two great curvatures in the stomach. We have two curvatures. One is the greater curvature and the lesser curvature. And as you see, we have kind of two sphincters that aren't really shown here. One sphincter is going to be here, and that's the pyloric sphincter, and that's where the stomach empties into the intestines. And as we can see, it empties into the duodenum to be exact. And there's also going to be a sphincter up here, which isn't shown, but it's the esophageal sphincter. And this is when this food that's coming down through the esophagus empties into the stomach. And then we have a kind of like three muscular layers of the stomach, and we call this the muscularis externa. And we have a longitudinal layer, we have a circular layer, and an oblique layer. And later on, we're going to talk about why we have three different layers of muscle surrounding the stomach. It comes in important when it talks about mixtures and things like that. So we'll get into that and why that's important. And over here, if we take a section of the stomach, this is what we would see the epithelium of the stomach looks like. So basically, we have gastric pits, which open into gastric glands, and then all the specialized cells that release make up the gastric juice or secretions in the stomach we see here. And we're going to get into all these cells. So first, we have the mucus cells, right? They're going to be always at the top of these gastric pits, at the top of the gastric glands. And these mucus cells are going to be secreting mucus to protect the stomach from the acidic environment that is within the stomach. And then we have the mucus neck cells, which are right around here, really the beginning of the gland itself. And these mucus neck cells are going to be secreting bicarbonate. And bicarbonate is going to function as a buffer. It buffers the gastric acid and prevents damage to the epithelium as well. So right here we have two specialized cells that are used for protection from the acidic environment. And then as we move down, we have parietal cells, and the parietal cells are going to be secreting intrinsic factor and gastric acid, or gastric juice, more known. And basically, the gastric acid activates pepsin, which we'll get into pepsin a little bit later. And it also kills bacteria. That low acidic environment is going to kill the bacteria. And then intrinsic factor is going to mix with complex of vitamin B12 and is also going to permit absorption. So that's going to function later. And we'll get into all of these cells and everything, secretions, a little bit further. You'll understand later on in the presentation. And basically, as we keep moving down, we have the chief cells, right? And chief cells are going to be secreting pepsinogen. And pepsinogen, as we mentioned before, pepsin is broken down by gastric acid into pepsin. And pepsin digests proteins, right? And moving further along, we have the G cells. G cells are going to be secreting gastrin, which is a hormone that stimulates gastric acid secretion. So we'll get into this cycle of how all this plays into and communicates and plays a role. And as you see in this little cutout here, we have some smooth muscle cells right around the glands. And these smooth muscle is basically going to work as a contraction to squeeze all the gastric secretions up out of that pit into the stomach lumen. Okay, so let's get into the phases of digestion, right? So we have basically 3 phases of digestion. It's going to be 1, the cephalic phase, 2, the gastric phase, which we're going to talk more in detail about here today, and we have the intestinal phase. And the cephalic phase basically happens way before food even enters the stomach, way before food even enters, excuse me, the mouth, right? This is when you're thinking about food, or you're smelling food, or you see food, or even when you taste food, and it's basically the reflex phase. And in this phase, it actually is prepping the stomach for the gastric phase. So we do get a little bit of gastric secretions going on during this phase. Not as much as we're going to get in that gastric phase, but we get a tiny bit here in that cephalic phase to get the stomach ready. Say, hey, there's something coming down the pipeline here through that esophagus. We got to get ready. So then the gastric phase lasts about 3 to 4 hours and is triggered when food enters into the stomach. And this happens with the help of local neural and hormonal mechanisms. So some of those hormonal mechanisms, like we mentioned earlier, are going to be that gastrin, that hormone that's released by G cells, and things like that. And then we have local mechanisms that we haven't mentioned yet, but we will mention in the upcoming slides. And lastly, we have the intestinal phase. And this phase is basically once that food is emptied into the intestines, like the duodenum, like we mentioned, when we talked about the anatomy of the stomach. And this part plays a major role in the digestive process as well, which is why the stomach has to kind of function as a storage unit when we eat more than the body can handle or more than the body can process at one time. So now we're going to get into basically the functions and more about the gastric phase. So the gastric phase has 3 functions, and one is to enhance secretions. So those gastric secretions that slightly happen during the cephalic phase, during the gastric phase, those secretions are going to be enhanced and more intense, right? And then we have another function is to homogenize an acidified chyme. So basically, you want to keep pumping out more acid to break down whatever food and fight off whatever pathogens that are coming into the stomach, right? You want to protect the body and you want to digest. That's what the stomach wants to do. And then the last function is to initiate the digestion of proteins. This will help the intestines further break down any proteins that make it to the duodenum. So the protein digestion begins in the stomach, it moves on to the duodenum and further continues. And basically the mechanisms that the gastric phase uses are the neural and hormonal mechanisms. In the neural, we have a short-term reflex, which is triggered by the stimulation of chemoreceptors and pH increasing. And then 2, we have a stimulation of stretch receptors in stomach as the stomach expands. So you have chemoreceptors and you have stretch receptors. Chemoreceptors are monitoring pH. Stretch receptors are monitoring that stomach as it gets larger. So once those receptors are saying, hey, we're stretching hey, something's going on here. I think something's in the stomach. We need to add more secretions, and chemoreceptors are doing the same thing. That pH increases above 2. Uh, the chemoreceptors respond to that and say, hey, we need more secretions to break down what's in the stomach, okay? And then the resulting action of the gastric phase are basically increased pepsinogen and acid production, along with increased activity of mixing waves. So those mixing waves come from those 3 layers that we mentioned earlier, those 3 muscular layers of the stomach we mentioned earlier, the muscularis, right? The external muscularis, the longitudinal, the oblique, and the other muscular layer of the stomach, right? So that's how we get that mixing wave effect. All those muscles contract, and then it kind of makes a mixing wave effect. And then we're going to see a little graphic of how this happens, right? So in this graphic, we see that a branch from the central nervous system along the vagus nerve branches off around the stomach into the submucosal plexus. And the submucosal plexus is going to be in charge of giving signals to mucus cells, chief cells, and parietal cells, and also the G cells, those cells we mentioned earlier that are in the gastric glands and are involved in gastric secretions. And we also see another branch of the vagus nerve that it kind of goes along the other side of the stomach wall. And basically, this is going to be the cycle that we see here, all transmitted to the medulla oblongata via the vagus nerve and the central nervous system. So when we begin here, food enters through the esophagus into the stomach, right? And the pH begins to elevate above 2, and chemoreceptors respond to that. And also the stomach begins to expand, so distension, and the stretch receptors respond to that. And these signals are transmitted to the submucosal and myenteric plexuses, and then that increases acetylcholine and other signals to mucus cells, chief cells, parietal cells, and G cells. And once these are all activated, we get, like mentioned earlier, mucus coming from the mucus cells. We get pepsinogen, which will be broken down to pepsin by the gastric juice here, or gastric acid. And that's going to be involved in the breakdown of proteins by the chief cells. And then we also have parietal cells, which are going to be increasing the secretion of gastric juice or gastric acid. And lastly, we have G cells, which are going to be releasing gastrin into the circulation. And we see here that gastrin then further increases the secretion of, or further increases the signals to chief cells to release pepsinogen, and parietal cells to release gastric juice. And also we see here that the submucosal and myenteric plexuses send a signal to increase the mixing waves, that muscularis externa, longitudinal muscle, oblique muscle, and circular muscle that we mentioned in the stomach anatomy wall. All those muscles are going to be activated, and we get the mixing wave effect, and we get kind of like a double dose of signal from the submucosal and myenteric plexus via the short-term reflex here with the stretch receptors and chemoreceptors, and then the long-term reflex of those here with the gastrin secretion. And this is kind of the cycle that we see for the gastric phase of digestion. And this is going to continue until the short-term reflex says, hey, no longer stretching, when the pH is back down to about 2 or below 2. And then also when the basically when the pH drops, the short-term reflex stops, and all of this cycle will discontinue until there is once again an elevation in pH or more distension. And that's basically how the gastric phase of digestion functions and works. This whole cycle here will continue to break down food as long as food is in that stomach, and the mixing wave will continue until the food is released into the duodenum. Here's my work cited for this, and yeah, thank you for listening.